So the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to first talk about web server reconnaissance. So I'm going to basically shift you over to a broader view of what an attacker is trying to do. So I'm going to talk first about reconnaissance. I'm going to talk about some of the automation tools that an attacker might point at projects. And then some of the activity the attacker would do after compromising the project. And then I'm going to talk next week about this thing called the MITRE framework, which is the MITRE attack framework, which is a way companies are trying to enumerate security controls to stop adversaries. So this is sort of a broader, higher level view of what's going on in the security industry that you'll need to know. And the reason why I'm doing this at the very end is because some of the things that we're going to talk about, you need to know the very low-level specific things. So that's what the first 8 weeks of this class was. Is like, now I know what an SSRF is. Now I know what a cross-site scripting thing is. Now I can just use the tools. Treat that as an abstraction. I'll point a tool at it, and then the tool is going to do all these things. Or I'll have a control. The control prevents privilege escalation or detects it. I'm going to point that. So in order for me to describe these higher level things, we needed the lower level things. And so I'm going to move more towards the higher level stuff. The first thing I'm going to talk about is web server reconnaissance. So if you are an adversary looking to target someone, one of the things you would like to do is to gather as much information about that target without that target knowing, without revealing yourself to the target. So I'm going to just talk briefly about web server reconnaissance. Some of the things that you would want to do is basically figure out, and I'm talking more at the machine level, you would want to do the reconnaissance operation on the people as well. So, but most of the, you'll see there are tools to scrape LinkedIn, to scrape social media, to scrape the company websites, to scrape data dumps that have company email addresses in those data dumps. So there is this reconnaissance step that you would need to do social engineering. Not going to cover that. But what I'm going to talk about here is reconnaissance for the servers, the machines, the infrastructure that company is using. So things like the name and the version of the server they're running, the back end, whether or not they're using a reverse proxy, if they're using a firewall, what version of that firewall are they running? So these are things that you can elucidate if you do this reconnaissance operation. One of the easiest things you could do is to view the HTTP headers and to see servers will usually identify themselves in the response headers. So here's an example connecting over HTTP to the server vulnerable, and vulnerable coughs up the fact that it's running Debian, Apache 2.2.16, PHP 5, and then with that you know exactly when the operating system was last updated. Right, because these version numbers, you just Google the version numbers and you say, when was the release date of that version? And then you know that all the bugs that came after that date are fair game to point at this server. So you could do this on Oregon CTF to see how well I've updated that site. It's been a year or two, so maybe you can get on that site. And then this one, you can figure out what this thing is running. Just using the netcat commands. I'm not going to do that here because I think you could do this offline. Another thing you can do is you can access the website and then you can just view the source. What is that website giving back to me? And there are very useful hints in the HTML. So you're using software to produce the web content now. And so because of that, you immediately give up the sort of the framework that you're using to do the content generation. So here's an example of Wikipedia. What do you think Wikipedia runs on the back end? If you can see that, it's kind of an eye chart. It's PHP. You see PHP right there on the right there. So you know maybe I should point my PHP attack tools at that thing. Here's Mercedes-Benz from a while ago. What do you think that thing runs? This will be one of your, well, not Mercedes-Benz, but you'll be looking at this kind of tool to scan this site. This one's a little harder. You actually have to have had some experience with this tool in order to figure out what it is. WordPress. So you see all of the WordPress stuff has WP dash something in it. Here's Hyatt. Hyatt.com. What do you think it runs? That is Java server pages. So this is probably vulnerable to those deserialization. Maybe it's running struts or one of these other vulnerable Java frameworks. So it's running a Java framework. And those are the ones, because they're Java objects being passed back and forth sometimes, you might want to point those kinds of attacks at this thing. What about this one? GitHub. What's GitHub running? This one's really hard. What's it? Oh, yeah. I can't. So the hint is there's nothing really there, but there is a particular framework that will compile all your CSS files into a particular unique, you see that long string of random junk? There's a particular framework that does that. It's actually Ruby. Ruby on Rails does that. So that's where that hint was. You're supposed to Google it, but whatever. It's Ruby on Rails. What about Blackboard? If you know what ASP. So this is .NET. Okay, so that's one of the things you can do. It's much easier to do this with a service. So you could basically go to any of these things, built with, Wapalizer, and URL scan, and they'll tell you exactly the version and the sort of the frameworks that are being used for each one of these sites. So I'm going to click on this one so you can see what your homework server was running. And so you can see this is Java. It uses jQuery. It's got Apache, Tomcat Coyote, which is super old. Uses CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so that's one of the things you would do. And then you could narrow down the kinds of things that might work against this website. Another thing an adversary will do is use search engine signals to figure out what to attack on the back end. So there's this thing called Google Dorks, which is it's a library of ways of using Google to do your adversarial job for you. So different hacks that you can search for to basically expose things that companies probably didn't know were exposable. So one of the things that Google Dorks has is to look at the robots.txt file. So the robots.txt is a file that tells search engines, don't look here. But it's like, you put that up on the internet, and then the people who are going to look there are the ones you don't want to have look. The adversary is going to be like, sweet, look at all these directories you don't want Google to look at. I'm going to look at it for you. So that's basically what'll happen. So here's an example. You put this on the top level directory, and it's saying, oh, don't look at this thing, cyberworld map, temp, or foo.html. And then, of course, that's just telling this, this is still accessible. It just doesn't want Google to index it. But Google is going to index the robots.txt, and then you can have the, or you can just brute force getting all the robots.txt, and then you have this signal. So that's not a good thing. Here's a Joomla site. And so you can see, hey, this is disallowing all of this stuff. But unless you have locked down the permissions on each one of those directories, then the adversary is just going to go in and get those things. Okay, another thing you can do are look for artifacts. So not necessarily in the source tree, but like things like this. So favoriteicon.ico, that's the thing that shows up in your browser as the icon for that site. So in that tab, you see that icon. What is this site running? If you know your icons. This is Drupal's icon, yep. One of the most famous pieces of malware was this search engine worm, Santi. If you look at what this was doing, it was basically using Google to find all the sites that had PHPBB in it, all the links. So just Google search PHPBB, and Google is like, hey, here are all the targets that you can hit with your exploit. And so all of the PHPBB sites were vulnerable. And so this worm used Google to spread itself, right? Because target acquisition is actually quite hard. Like one of these early worms, like when you get infected, you want to find the next target. Early worms were just scanning the internet, just brute force. But then it was causing the internet, like people knew something was up by all of these scans going on. As a worm, you want to be a little bit more quiet. And so what this thing was doing is like, I'm just going to directly compromise it, and then Google is the thing that was doing my indexing work for me. So that's why I left that in there. It's quite old, but probably still effective. The kind of technique is still effective. Another thing you can do is look for error pages that aren't sanitized. So here's one. You send a random long string to a site, and if the site hasn't sanitized its errors to basically anonymize the package that it's running, you can reveal these artifacts directly. So this one is telling you it's running Apache Tomcat with a specific version number. So that then the adversary would go and find that version number and see if there's any exploits. Here's one. Even when you do sanitize it, unless you do a custom sanitization, if you use something that looks like this, it's like, oh, that's the default Ruby error page. And then you're like, okay, they're running Ruby on the back end. You can do fuzzing. So with fuzzing, you're basically spraying random input at all the forms on that site. And if the web application hasn't sanitized the error messages, you could get a full stack trace. You should never see this on your website. A full stack trace, and if you look at what this stack trace gives you, it's all the different packages. Every package that this path relied upon is listed in this stack trace. So, and then you can see this is Tomcat. The last thing, we talked about these TLS transparency reports as being a good thing. So the idea is that if you have all these certificate authorities that are minting certificates and somebody compromises a certificate authority, that adversary could mint a google.com certificate and then do a man-in-the-middle attack where it's sending you a page that looks like it came from google.com, but is actually the adversary's. And so the transparency, certificate transparency, is that every single certificate authority, when they sign a certificate, will publish that they signed this certificate for everyone to see. But the act of publishing, so eventually, if you are a browser and you're looking to see whether a certificate is legitimate or not, that certificate must have been published in this central repository for you to then accept it as being valid. So it's a good thing in that regard to protect against these man-in-the-middle attacks, but it's a bad thing because then you can see all of the certificates that a particular organization is minting, right? Every certificate that an organization mints, you can say, oh, there's a new website that just came online. I don't have to do a scan, right? Like I actually just look at the transparency logs and figure out all of these new servers that have just come online on my target. So this is something that can be done. There are 2 sites that allow you to look at the transparency logs. So this is Google's, and then this is Mozilla has this. And so you can go to the Google one, and then you can look up all of the certificates associated with this domain. So you can see all the stuff I'm running, which is what I'm going to show you. Not that you would attack it or anything, but where did that list go? And so you can see I last did a bunch of stuff. Was this yesterday? No. Wait, February. This is from last month. So you can see the details of this. Oh wait, no. Valid from. These are the ones I just did. March 3rd, 2020. So if you go through here, you see a bunch of these certificates that have just been validated, two entries in the logs. And so I have a wildcard I have a wildcard certificate. It's one certificate that can issue all of these domains. And so by just searching for the top level domain, this thing exposes all of the certificates I've issued on that. So then you can actually go and attack these things directly. This is a reconnaissance thing that saves an adversary some time. And so this is what they'll be scanning to find new targets. Okay. Let's Encrypt had a bug, which forced me to renew all of my certificates a couple days ago, which is why this happened a couple days ago. Okay, so that is the end of the techniques. Now I'm going to sort of shift gears. So the last set of labs is for you to use some of these tools, the vulnerability scanning and exploitation tools. So if you can imagine being a company with 1,000 different weapons, this is common. A company can have thousands of properties, thousands of websites, and they could be running all of these different microservices on their back end. They have a hard time being able to secure all of that, right? And if you have 1,000 sites, you're not going to be able to get a single person like any of you to be able to go through all of them in any meaningful time before more sites get deployed or more updates get deployed. And so in order to address this, a lot of these companies are requiring automation. Like, how can I automatically scan and find vulnerabilities in anything that I have deployed? And the reason why they're doing that is because the hackers are doing this, right? The hackers are also trying to scale their security operations, so they're doing a bunch of automation as well. And so this last section of this course is to expose you to the kinds of tools that you would come across in the workplace to do this kind of scanning. The word of caution is that some of these, you should know what each one of these tools is doing, because if you're trying to stay under the radar, you'll see that some of these tools are actually quite loud. So for example, if you're hired to do a penetration test on a company, and the company can detect that you are doing something and thwart you, you lose money, right? Like, you're like, that failed. You're not, you basically aren't able to finish your job as a penetration tester if you're caught. And so typically you would want your tool to be sort of quiet, undetectable, below the radar. A lot of these tools are incomplete. So this is basically software projects that people have come up with to try and get at all of the different vulnerabilities, but it's really hard to enumerate how you would compromise each thing efficiently, deterministically. And so it really can't replace a creative human. And when you think about some of your homework levels, like, how would you get a tool to solve some of those? That's pretty difficult. But what they can do, they're really good for QA, right? Like, if you are spraying the heck out of your website and you see that maybe some data gets reflected back, you're like, oh, there's some kind of cross-site scripting going on in this site. And then you could go remediate this. So it's more like a QA tool for a lot of companies. So there's a Linux distribution called Kali, and this is the thing that you're going to be running in your labs. This is a one-stop shop for all of the attack tools, and then some. So this is a Linux-based VM, and I have this VM as an image on Google Cloud. And so what I'm going to have you do is instantiate Kali on Google Cloud, and I'm going to have you instantiate a whole bunch of servers, some vulnerable, some not vulnerable, and then I'm going to have you point some of the Kali tools at these servers, and then you can see how these tools work. One of the things you're going to point it at is the Web for Pen Tester VMs, right? Because you all know which exercises are vulnerable, so you'll know exactly what the answer should be. When you point like a cross-site scripting tool at the cross-site scripting examples, it should find all of those for you. And so I'm glad I'm doing this now instead of at the beginning, because you could have easily just done that. You just say, I'm going to point the tool and solve the level without having to do any work, is the thing. So this is a list of all the classes of tools that are on that VM. And so we're only going to focus on the web hacking ones, because it's mostly a web course. But all of this stuff is available to you if you run this VM. But we're going to focus mostly on information gathering, vulnerability, exploitation, and web applications. Those are actually password attacks also. We'll be doing a little bit with that. So these are the tools that I'm going to have you run. WFuzz, Nmap, W3AF, WordPress scan, SQL map, XSS strike, Hydra. This, a lot of you are already doing, but we're not going to run that in the labs. But this is sort of so the first set, these are all command line tools, right? I just issue a command and it launches the thing at the site, so you don't need a GUI. Another set of tool that's actually on Kali VM is Burp, which is sort of a GUI-based proxy way of attacking sites. So those are scanning tools at the top. There's an exploitation tool, Comics, which is actually for command line injection. It actually gets you a shell. And then the last tool that you're going to use is Metasploit, which does basically everything in the chain. It does reconnaissance, scanning, exploitation, post-exploitation, exfiltration. All of these functions are in this single tool. So I'm going to have you run all of these things. I'm going to do just a brief rundown of each one of these tools and then allow you to just go and do the labs. So the first tool is WFuzz. This is the web fuzzer. And so one of the things that people do is security by obscurity, hidden directories, hidden files. And so what WFuzz does is it has a library of all the different file names and file directory names that people commonly use, and it will just scan your web server for all of them. See which ones give you 404s and see what is not found, 404, and then which ones give you a 200. And then it'll just report back all of the subdirectories that are available to it. So this is how you would invoke it. You would give it a word list, and then you would look at this site, and then the special keyword is capital F-U-Z-Z, and then it will do a substitution of all the words in this file with that, and it'll report back which ones are going to give you 200s. So it's a really simple tool. Nmap, this is an industry standard tool. It's an open source network scanner. And it basically allows you to determine all the hosts on a particular subnet, the operating systems they're running, the servers that they're running. You can programmatically give Nmap scripts to run. So if you want to do application-specific fingerprinting with Nmap, you could do it with these NSC scripts. Here's an example of using it. So say I want to enumerate all of the IP addresses that are alive on Portland State's Class B subnet. I could just do an Nmap of this. I don't recommend that you do it. But you could. Nmap is a tool, and this will do it in a way that's really scalable. So this is like 65,000 times however many ports you're going to check on all these addresses. The way Nmap is able to do this in a really scalable way is to use raw IP sockets. So this is something that you can look into if you're interested in these aren't actual real connections it makes, but it uses IP packets in a novel way to get scalability. Another tool you're going to run is WordPress scan. So this is something that targets WordPress specifically. So because a vast majority of sites are using WordPress, what you want to do is make sure that the WordPress installation that you have doesn't have any current vulnerabilities. So this particular tool has a backend database, a real-time backend database, so a central repository where this WP vulndb site, which you don't see here, has the up-to-date CVEs for every single WordPress vulnerability, and then this tool will query that backend and then scan any WordPress site you point it to find all the CVEs. So this is an example of it running, and it will expose, for example, this one has this particular vulnerability, and it's enumerated in wpvulndb.com. It gives you the number, and then you can see exactly what your exposure is. So I'll have you point that to a WordPress site. So you basically just give it the URL of a WordPress site, and then it goes and it pulls out all the CVEs that are exposed on that site. Hydra is a password cracking tool. And Hydra can work on anything, SSH, HTTP auth, remote desktop, RDP, which is the Windows way of logging in. You just give it the protocol, and it will brute force that port with all of the popular username passwords. And in fact, you can actually give it the have I been owned data for it to use against all of those sites. So this is what I would imagine the Iranians are doing on the ICS stuff, because when they talk about password spraying and this kind of stuff, they're talking about this, where you would just get a list. And so Hydra comes with a list like of the most common ones, so you can just use Hydras, or if you are if you can target your list, if you can scan for less, you would be able to do a custom list. So yeah, you see databases, HTTP, RDP, anything that has a username password, this thing is going to try and brute force. Can't brute force that second factor though, so that's why you would need two-factor on this stuff. So here's an example of using it for SSH. Say I have an IP address, and I'm going to say, Hydra, use a whole bunch of users and a whole bunch of passwords against that SSH, and then tell me which ones have worked. I'm going to have you do this on the HTTP basic auth example. So if you remember, I think one of the authentication levels, it was like admin. So I'm going to just point, you're going to just point Hydra to that site. And so yeah, these are a lot of tools, but actually running them is just going to take you like 10 seconds. So this might seem like lengthy labs, but actually you're going to spend the majority of your time setting up servers. The tool itself is just going to run very quickly. SQL Map is a tool that specifically tries to compromise databases. And so what it will do is it'll automatically try and launch. Well, it'll find all the injection points and see if it can inject in any of the form parameters. And then what it'll do is it'll automatically see if it can do a blind SQL injection attack to dump all the tables. It'll look for information schema, and then it'll look for all the different tables that are in that database, and it'll try and dump all of it. And it's all automated, so you're not having to manually figure out what the columns are. So what I'm going to have you do is use SQL Map against some of your SQL injection levels on Web for Pentester to show how this tool can basically do the exact same operation that you were doing manually. Okay, XSS strike is something similar to SQL Map. You just point it at a URL, just like in So in SQL Map, you point it to a URL, and then you either give it the injection parameter if it's in a get parameter, or you give it the post data, where to inject into the post data. So XSS strike is similar, where you basically point it at a URL that you think has an XSS vulnerability, and then what it'll do is it'll automatically figure out whether or not certain payloads that it has generated will be reflected back onto it. So then you can see, hey, this is the payload that if you send to that URL, it will come back, and then you know you have an XSS vulnerability in there. Okay. Another tool that you're going to use is W3AF. This is the Web Application Audit Framework. And so this is a larger Python tool. It's basically a suite of tools. There are 3 phases when you're using W3AF. There's a discovery set of things where you're trying to figure out what URL to attack. There's an audit that says probe that route for a particular kind of vulnerability. So it's more than just a single purpose web vulnerability scanner. You've got a library of vulnerabilities that you can check with W3AF. And then there's an attack mode where you can actually do an exploitation of that vulnerability. And so here are some of the things that are in this tool. If you look at the auditing, you can audit against all of these different types of vulnerabilities on the left. I'm only going to have you do XSS, and I think I'm going to have you do command injection. OS commanding, those are the only 2 that I'm going to have you do out of here. But you can see the breadth of what you can do with a tool like this. Another specialized tool is comics. This is just a command injection exploiter. As soon as it figures out it has shell access, it'll give you a shell. And so I'm gonna have you point this tool at one of your Web for Pen Tester levels that you were actually executing commands on. So that will be this tool. Yeah.
This wasn't in the web file. There was like a web shell that you could get into. You just needed to like access the logs.
Oh yeah, so there was a vulnerability in our last level. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Show that to me after class. Okay, the last tool is Metasploit. So this is like the Swiss Army knife for people to use to attack sites. It's the de facto tool for penetration testing. It's got a framework for exploiting these vulnerabilities. This is where whenever an exploit is released or whenever a patch is released, somebody will develop an exploit module that Metasploit can use to basically compromise the site immediately. And you don't, as an adversary, you don't need to know what that compromise is doing. This is just a standard way of you to get shells on the back end. So there is a rich library of modules, so thousands of exploits, hundreds of payloads. It's extremely extensible. So there are plugins that you can write to add functionality into this framework. I am going to have you use Metasploit. I'm going to have you bring up the Apache struts vulnerability that Equifax got compromised with. And I have you use Metasploit to not only look up the exploit that was used, but to then launch it on a version of the server that I'm going to have you bring up. So you're going to bring up the vulnerable server on Compute Engine, and then you're going to point Metasploit at it, and then you're going to see how you can get a shell directly using Metasploit. So that's the last lab of this series. This is the architecture of Metasploit. It's on the right is what you get, which is your interface, the CLI. There's a web interface, a GUI, and then you have the core, which is has access to libraries. And then what people can do is write a whole bunch of modules that allow you to extend Metasploit. So if you have a new exploit, you would just integrate it into this framework, and then it would just be usable immediately by anybody who updated your module. There are different payloads you want to deliver. So one of the example payloads is, I want a reverse shell. So once you exploit the vulnerability, get me a shell would be a payload. Encoders are ways of making sure that your payload and your exploit don't get detected. So if you are trying to evade detection by some sensor that the defender has, then you would want to encode it in different things. Like, for example, you were trying to bypass encoding filters by URL encoding things to slip by filters. That's what this is doing. Can I encode the payload in a way that can stay under the radar? This post-exploitation stuff, so if I'm on the server and all of a sudden I have access, but I want actually administrator access. So a post-exploit thing to do would be to install a keyboard sniffer. Or maybe I will dump network traffic until I see some credentials go by. This is what a post-exploitation operation would do. And then finally, there are some tools that allow you to do things like exfiltrate under the radar using the tool. So it's basically an end-to-end tool for compromising a target. So you'll be getting a little bit of experience with this. This is what the UI looks like when you bring it up. Well, the banner is different every time you launch it, so it'll kind of like you'll have MSF. This is the console prompt. MSF console prompt will be the same. So you're going to be familiarizing yourself with the different exploits that are there. The exploits are ranked, so you can actually figure out whether or not the exploit is going to work by whether or not it has these ratings. So excellent means it works every time. You have these encoders. I mentioned those before to bypass antivirus. The payloads, so depending on the target that you're going to scan, then you would want to execute a certain payload after you have compromised the machine. One of the most popular payloads for Windows machines is this tool called a module called Mimikatz. This was a credential dumping tool. What it did was it looked through all of memory, and Windows, every time it does authentication, it brings up the credentials in memory, and then this tool would basically like scan memory in well-known places where it knew Windows stored the credentials and then just dumped that. So this is an extremely popular password dumping tool that hopefully doesn't work anymore, but there's a video. I did this as a demo once in my malware class where there's a video of this tool being used. So this is what it looks like using Metasploit. You would figure out an exploit that you'd want to send to the victim. You would send it, and then with the payload, and the payload would somehow connect back up to you. And then you would potentially install some post sort of exploit software, and then you can interactively control your target from there. And this is what you'll be doing in your lab on that server that you bring up. Okay. Talked about most of these. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is scanning as a service. Say you're lazy and you don't want to do any of that. And we're like, gosh, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of typing. That's a lot of testing. So a lot of these, this is huge in the security industry now. It's like, I'm going to have a startup company. I'm going to do all this stuff for you. So this scanning as a service is a big deal. Here are some of the free sites. If you want people to scan your site for vulnerabilities, you just sign up and they'll do it for you. These are the big companies that are being paid to do this. So Tenable, there used to be this open source tool called Nessus that would basically scan your site and produce all the vulnerabilities. This is now a commercial product that Tenable does. NetSparker is another company. Rapid7 these are the folks who developed Metasploit. They have a professional version now that will do this. And then Google, on your cloud project, if you want to add this as a value add on top of your your cloud project, you could sign up for this and then have it do the monitoring for you. AWS has this as well. You can actually add this kind of scanning on your AWS project to reveal these things in real time. If you're really lazy, you could just do a web search for stuff that you have exposed that this site called Shodan has identified. So Shodan is the search engine for vulnerable IP addresses. It's non-stop scanning the IP address range for stuff that it knows shouldn't be up and online and accessible. This is one of my favorite sites. You can click on this, and there are a whole bunch of really interesting searches that you can do to find all the things on the internet that are like voting machines, traffic lights, unprotected VNC, so you get an instant shell on someone else's remote desktop for Linux, webcams, and this get a job one is my favorite because this one, if you run, just to show you PayPal has a sense of humor. This is a search that says, give me all of the web servers that return an X recruiting header. And then if you look at the only people who are doing this, where is it? Hopefully it's still here. It's not here anymore. Oh, well. There used to be text that said, oh yeah, here it is. Oh, Zappos. So if you're reading this, maybe you should be working at Zappos instead. So you can't see that here. Let me, forward you to a job site if you're using this to find out vulnerabilities. I like some of these other ones too. If you have time, go and click on these. The voting machine one's kind of funny. You can basically, oh, that doesn't work anymore. What? Here, let's do some webcam. Maybe the web, wow. The webcam one is pretty interesting because this will actually give you the images of stuff that's open. Yeah, so this is a search engine for doing that. So again, these are things that the adversary has access to and that you should probably use yourself just so that you understand what you're up against. Okay, and so with that, the labs and the homework, you're going to be exercising all of those things. The actual mechanics of running the tool will be very fast. It's the setting everything up that's a pain in the neck. So go ahead and start that. You have about 30 minutes to get that up and running. So you have a lot more time now that you don't have to do the cloud goat thing anymore.